Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Petley. I'm the senior researcher for the Institute, and my guest today is Steve Davies, an historian, a senior educational fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs. He's also involved at the John Locke Institute. He's published a number of books, including one called Apocalypse Next, and one that's coming out soon is going to be called The Great Realignment. Welcome, Steve. Today, what I'd like to discuss with you is what happens when the lights go out. What I'd like to discuss with you is the economic implications for anything, say, from a power cut like the one that happened in Spain and
Mm.
Portugal a few months ago on one end of the scale, to something like a repeat of the great electromagnetic storm of 1859, which even in those days caused quite considerable problems for telegraph pylons. So, what would happen, say, if we had a half-day blackout? How do you think that the country would cope economically?
Well, if there was to be a grid collapse, which is what we're talking about here, the collapse of the power distribution grid and therefore a nationwide power cut for that length of time, which is what happened in Spain and Portugal, I think that initially the response would be fairly moderate. It would be extremely inconvenient for a whole lot of businesses, not and also, of course, for private households and individuals. But if it was just like half a day or even a full day, the immediate impact would not be that great. It would, however, and this is worth emphasizing because it raises points that we may well explore later on, have a much more significant long-term impact than you might imagine. So let's say the power is off for 24 hours. What that means is that during that period, all kind of systems will go offline and stop working. And it will then take quite a while to get them up and running again once the power comes back on. So for individuals, you'll have a day where you're frantically trying to stop your frozen food defrosting, where you're getting rather cold or rather hot, depending on what time of year it happens at, and you've got no electric lighting. But once the power comes back on again, you're pretty much back to normal. But for businesses and many large organizations, including government, there's all kinds of disruption that would follow on from a power interruption of that size. Things like computer systems needing to be completely rebooted, no longer working, maybe a lot of data being lost, and a whole lot of other systems, usually mediated these days through apps of one kind or another, that wouldn't work initially. And it would take several days to a week for that to get back to normal. And that would be considerably costly. It would actually be a pretty measurable hit to GDP, although individual households and businesses would only each be sharing a small part of it because the hit would be rather because it would be systemic to the economy as a whole. So an interruption of that kind is not too serious, but at the same time, slightly more serious than people might imagine because I'm old enough to have experienced power cuts in the 1970s. And I can remember at the time they were extremely irritating and rather, discombobulating, but they weren't life-threatening or particularly serious. They were just annoying rather than anything else. And it would be much the same now, although, again, something we may spend more time on, the impact now would be greater than it was then, I think it's fair to say, for various reasons.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, I'm obviously probably a few years younger than you, but I can still just about remember the 1970s and the power cuts. But we were a much less digital society in those days. It was much more analog, much more things
Yes.
were done manually. But it's interesting you say that for households, the individually the disruption would be fairly minimal. It's rather like now, sometimes you have a localized power cut and you think, oh bother, I didn't save that file. You get it back. It can be a rather tedious process, but it's not the end of the world. But businesses and governments, they're going to be the ones that suffer the most. I mean, let's perhaps home in on governments. How much would they be affected if the power went off for, say, 12 hours?
Quite considerably, mainly because, and this, if you like, is the most extreme case of the more general phenomenon, mainly because it would disrupt a power cut of that kind would disrupt a lot of administrative systems because of the disruption it would bring to the online and digital way in which most of those systems, things like the government tax records, payment systems, things of that sort, the way they're organized. And that relates to the point you made, which is that um, what we have now is a society that is much more vulnerable to disruptions of this kind than was the case 40 or 50 years ago. And that is because we now have much more complex systems in many cases, a lot of which are totally dependent on sustained electrical power, which is why even a 12-hour or 24-hour blackout could have some pretty significant effects. Because you mentioned the case of a household where you forget to save a file and you lose the file. Maybe it's gone forever into cyberspace, into the ether. Maybe you can recover it. Well, the same thing would happen on a much, much larger scale with large amounts of data and also decision-making processes, algorithms, and things of that sort running on platforms that are used by government or by large corporations. Now, just as you might in the household be able to recover that file that you've lost because of the cut, they would eventually be able to put back together those systems. But that would be much, much more difficult and costly, simply because the scale would be much larger. Now, what this does raise, though, is the question of, let's say it's not a blackout for just 24 hours. Let's say you're talking about something that lasts 3 to 4 days or 5 days. In that case, quite suddenly, the impact would be a whole order of magnitude, at least one order of magnitude, maybe even two orders, i.e., 100 times worse and more severe. In other words, the damage done by a major interruption to power does not scale linearly. It's not that 2 days is twice as bad as one day, 3 days, three times worse. It goes up in a power order. Now, why is that? Well, take the household. Most households only have about 2 to 3 days worth of food in stock. And if you have a power cut, most of that food will be either used up or will rapidly become inedible. Meanwhile, what you would find if you have a power cut that's prolonged is major disruption, in fact, probably the breakdown of things like food distribution, because all of the complex distribution systems that we now have, the logistics, as well as depending on fleets of vehicles, which are not electric, of course, it also depends on complex electronic systems to organize where things are kept, where they're released, how they're accessed. And all that would be massively disrupted. So you would find that you'd run out of food, but that also your local grocery store very rapidly ran out of food, not least because of panic buying, I would imagine. And similarly, all kinds of systems that people depend on would suddenly stop working. And the longer this goes on for, the more severe and difficult to recover from the disruption is. Take, for example, the railway system. Most of the long distance train routes in the UK now are electrified, the East Coast and West Coast Main Line, the West Main Line out to Cardiff and South Wales. Now, if the power goes down completely, they'll be disrupted as well. That's bad enough if it's just one day, but if it goes on for several days, it means that lots and lots of trains are in completely the wrong place, essentially. And getting the whole system back running, even once the power comes back on, you're looking at several days, maybe a whole week of disruption. And of course, the railway system still does carry an awful lot of freight and goods. So you would have wider distributional effects on the whole consumer economy. So if one day would be very bad but manageable. But having a power cut that lasted for, let's say, a week or more would be really, really disruptive. Now, the danger is that at a certain point, the systems are just too brittle. They can't cope with a stress of this kind, and the system just collapses. And when that happens, it becomes really hard, maybe even impossible, to put it back together again.
That's really quite disturbing. So, I mean, although, as I said, some events seem to be very much one-offs, like we haven't had anything as bad as the famous 1859 electromagnetic storm in, well, now over 160 years, but it might happen. We can't rule it out. So is there anything that we as individuals, that companies, that businesses, even the government can do to prepare and to try and do something to mitigate the effects of a
Yeah.
disaster like this?
Well, before I reply directly to your question, let me just say something about that event in 1859, the Carrington event, as it's usually
Yeah.
called, after the British astronomer Richard Carrington, who first identified it. It was an example of what is known as a coronal mass ejection, which is a very large solar flare. Now, the point is that these flares happen on a regular basis. And only a few years ago, I think it was 2011, if my memory serves me right, maybe a bit later, we had a coronal flare, which was slightly more powerful than the 1859 one, and it missed the Earth, the planet, by a matter of a few thousand miles, which in interplanetary terms is nothing. And essentially, the risk of an event like that, a solar storm of that severity happening, is about half of 1% a year, maybe even 1% a year, depending on what state the sun is at a given period of time. Now, you might say, oh, that's a very low risk. But the problem is it's 1% every year, which means that sooner or later it's going to happen. And back in the day, in 1859, this really meant primarily just a lot of really spectacular northern lights. And this is what used to happen because we've had major solar storms during the Middle Ages. Back in the 8th century, we had three successive massive solar storms, which were up to 10 times more powerful than the 1859 one. But of course, that had absolutely no effect on our ancestors, apart from they got a completely free light show in the sky. But now, because we are so dependent on electricity, and electrical power to run all the complex systems we have, the effects would be absolutely massive. So there is a study by the US government which estimates that if a Carrington event style storm was to be reproduced, it would reduce US GDP and presumably by extension global GDP by about 10 to 12%, which is absolutely massive. Now, you might think what the point to make to answer your question is that we should do something because when you have a low probability event which has massive consequences were it to happen, the risk that you need to insure against is the probability is the consequential loss multiplied by the probability. So in this case, it's the hit to world GDP from that kind of event divided by 100 basically, since it's a 1 in 100 chance roughly. So that gives you an idea of just how much it's worth spending money on to try and insure against this. So what could you do? Well, you could do various things. If you're a household, then you could try the Mormon thing of keeping a large amount of food in your house. Mormons, as part of their religious duties, have to keep 6 months' food in the house at any given time. This is, I'm not quite sure why this is. Maybe it's in case the apocalypse comes, but all Mormon households do this. So keeping a stock of things like canned food, food that can be readily and easily cooked over something like a camping stove, that's one way of ensuring against disruption like this. And the point about that is it's always useful anyway. You can always use the food. In the normal course of events, having something like a camping stove is useful if you do want to go camping or you want to have a meal out in the backyard, that kind of thing. So you can take simple steps like that. You can also have the facility to, at least for in the short term, if you have a short-term interruption, keep food stored, not frozen. Sorry, keep food frozen, not thaw out too much if your freezer suddenly loses power. This is all worth doing anyway. You should also have cash on hand, and it's worth saying a bit more about that maybe later on, because one of the things that is very likely to happen with a major power disruption is the interruption to, or even possibly the collapse for a while of the payment system. And we these days tend to do most of our payments through electronic means. And so if you have a major power interruption, it's quite likely that ATMs will not work. Most online payment systems will stop functioning. And as a result, the whole network of payments and transfers on which commerce, business, the economy depends would just stop working. Now, we do have an alternative, of course. We've got cash, and it makes sense to keep a store of cash, presumably hidden away somewhere where only you know where it is, where for exactly contingencies like this. Now, at the level of, say, the government, what you need to do, and I've argued for this in the book you alluded to at the top of this podcast, Apocalypse Next, is to have fallback systems. You should not become totally dependent on digital or electrical or electronic systems. You should always have some analog systems uh, as a backup. So, for example, do not store all of your data, including particularly crucial or critical data, on formats, which means you can only access them if you have electrical power to run a system of some kind, a computer system. You should always have at least the vital data stored in the old-fashioned analog form of printed paper. That's always a good backup. You need to have other systems of that kind in place in order to protect against major interruptions to this. It's worth saying, by the way, that the former cabinet minister, Oliver Letwin, had a book published a few years ago in which he looked at the way in which everything could quite suddenly unravel if we had a serious interruption to the power system, simply because we've now become so dependent on online systems, electronic payment systems, and the like, that even a relatively short few days interruption to it, he, in his scenario, can suddenly cause all kinds of things to unravel. And before you know where you are, you have food riots, you have major civil unrest, you have the collapse of all kinds of systems, not least the payment system. So you need to have these backup systems that are there in case those electrical ones are disrupted. Now, you might say, well, this is a waste of money, but actually, when you look at the downside risks of this low probability of a devastating event, it actually makes economic sense, quite apart from any other kind of considerations you might have.
So the idea of moving more and more over to a completely automated digital society, for instance, getting rid of cash is really a rather bad idea.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a very bad idea for other reasons. I mean, I have serious civil liberties concerns with moving to a cashless society because it
Yeah.
gives the government the power to cut individuals off from having access to money and also to track and trace all of their spending decisions. So I think this is a really, really bad idea. And really, actually, if you're worried about the growth of the big brother state, you should be looking to spend cash, use cash, on a fairly regular basis, just to keep these guys on their toes. But yes, it's a very, very bad move in terms of societal resilience to move to completely electronic payment systems, because these are much less resilient in the face of not just natural events like a Carrington event, but also, let's say, a major cyber attack, like by a hostile power, than are their analog equivalents. And you just don't want to put yourself in that condition of vulnerability. And, we are talking here just a couple of days after the head of MI6 was talking in a public press conference about the threat, in her view, of serious cyber warfare from hostile or unfriendly great powers such as Russia. So that kind of, man-made threat, terrorism being another example, terrorist attacks on critical infrastructure that we should be thinking about. And what you want all the time is to have a system or a set of systems in place, including the payment system, which are resilient so that they cannot easily be disrupted or irretrievably damaged by either accidental or deliberate interruption of one kind or another. I mean, to give you an example of the terrorist, or for that matter, hostile power side of it, the global payment transfer system, SWIFT as it's called,
Hmm.
is run out of just 3 nodes. Now, if you were a terrorist, let's say you are a kind of updated version of the late Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, as he was called, and you want to bring down modern society, well, you might think with the collaborators that a way to do it would be to attack those 3 nodes. Now, they are guarded incredibly carefully, as you can imagine, but even so, a system that is going to collapse, in this case, the global payments transfer system, uh, if even 2 of those 3 nodes are taken out by an attack, is incredibly fragile. You do not want to be dependent on a system that is so vulnerable. And this is true for a lot of our systems. And it's very, very dangerous. And you can actually have too much of a good thing in this. You might think if you're an economist, well, you want to be as efficient as possible and have as little, fat as possible. But actually, that assumes that nothing seriously untoward or out of the normal is going to happen. And as Nassim Nicholas Taleb is constantly telling us, that's not the world we live in. We live in the world where tail end risk, low probability but high impact events are a very real phenomenon. And if your system is not built to deal with them, you're in real trouble.
So, what do you think would be the political implications if we had some sort of event, be it some sort of electromagnetic storm, which we keep coming back to, that really caused such complete chaos that we did end up, say, with rioting, we did end up with food riots and something like that. How do you think that would play out politically?
Well, it would be extremely bad news for the current managerial political class. Normally, when you get periods of chaos like that, what it does is to lead to a sharp shift towards authoritarianism, because the great mass of people, they value liberty, obviously, but they value security and stability and being able to go about their everyday life in a predictable and safe manner more highly, with good reason, because you could say that, well, in some sense, if you don't have that, you don't have anything else. And so, if you did have a severe social crisis, a major breakdown or collapse of public order, perhaps occasioned by some natural disaster or some other kind of event, maybe a major terrorist attack of some kind, the most likely outcome would be a significant shift towards a more authoritarian form of government. Now, whether that would prove permanent is an interesting question. It's hard to know the answer to that. That would depend, I think, on how our political class is perceived to have dealt with things. And if the perception is that it's really dealt with things badly or incompetently, which I'm afraid is rather likely on all the evidence, then it could well be that we would see a kind of big shift in public sentiment towards the idea that you need some kind of authoritative or even authoritarian system in place to prevent this kind of thing happening. Rather alarmingly, a lot of younger people, people under the age of 25, are already of that mind, it would appear, according to opinion poll surveys. So I think that is quite a likely long-term consequence for that kind of event.
That does sound very disturbing. Is there anything, is there any case to be made without sounding like a Luddite for a political movement to say we actually need to step back? We need to just build more resilience and not necessarily find ourselves so dependent on this technology, which is so vulnerable and so near the extreme of its capacity.
I think there's a very strong case for that, actually. I think that actually one of the arguments which I have made myself is that in many ways, modern life is too complex at the moment. And it's reached a level of complexity where it imposes very severe costs on ordinary people. Now, this is partly to do with the technology, but it's also to do simply with the way the technology is used, the organizational social systems that we have. And so all kinds of tasks which used to be quite simple now require that you go online, you confirm your identity, you then have to, wait for a code to come through to be able to do it, the kind of rigmarole that you have to go through. And all of this is extremely complex, very difficult for many people to navigate, and it imposes significant costs on ordinary people in the sense that a very large part of their time is used up navigating this network of complex systems that we now have in order to do what used to be comparatively simple tasks like buying a railway ticket, for example. Now, the point is that what has happened here is that the cost of doing certain kinds of business, the transactions costs, if you want to use the economics term for it, have been offloaded by economic providers onto the ordinary consumer. But the point is that there are gains from greater complexity. If you look at increased systemic complexity, the increased complexity of organization of payment systems, of production systems, distribution systems, these bring a payoff in terms of greater output. And for most of the time, the marginal gain, the gain in terms of extra output, or lower cost is greater than the marginal cost, which is the additional complexity you have to navigate. But I think we're getting to the point now where even if you don't take into account the threat of, shocks and exogenous events, the sheer cost of complexity is now greater than the marginal benefit. The marginal cost has started to become greater. And it's economically rational at that point to simply say, it's not worth going down this road any further. In fact, we should probably pull back a bit. And so I think that, yes, there is a very strong case, both politically and economically, for preemptively simplifying quite a lot of our economic systems, maybe shortening supply chains, for example, or maybe making supply chains less complex, less driven by just-in-time process. Go back to the system of having inventory for a while, or no, a certain amount of inventory and stock in place, so that the disruption to the production process of having, let's say, a power interruption or an interruption to global trade is not so great. And I think that this is becoming increasingly obvious. For example, I mean, before I finish here, we all remember how just a couple of years ago, one ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal had major effects worldwide, not just in Britain. And that shows you again just how complex and yet at the same time fragile a lot of the systems we have are. And so I think, yes, we do need to pull back. We need to make things we don't need to go right back to being incredibly simple. I'm not saying we should undo the online revolution or go back to not having the internet, much as some people might wish that, but I'm not one of them. But what we should be doing is thinking more about not only having redundancy built in and also having these lower tech fallbacks that I spoke about earlier, but also simply making a whole lot of processes, administrative processes, ways in which you do various things like buying and selling goods online, much simpler than they now are.
So thank you very much, Steve Davies. It's been fascinating to talk to you, and all the best.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on.